the biggest lie and the most hilarious lie the Seattle Times, one of the worst newspapers in the entire country, has ever done. They became an absolute organ of the left through, I think, Bill Gates' money. And I know Bill Gates gets blamed for a lot of things. But they set up a system in the Seattle Times, and they actually bragged about this. It's in a publication called Post Alley, where Frank Blethen, as I recall from memory, Frank is the publisher of the Seattle Times, got it through inheritance, as I recall from memory. And Blethen, I believe, was in this article in Post Alley bragging about this new business model. And the business model was they would have certain companies or organizations underwrite their news gathering on certain topics. Like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation came along and kindly helped a whole bunch of newspapers around the country, figure out how to cover COVID the right way. There were other organizations that might come along and say, we need to make sure that you're covering climate catastrophes the right way. So we'll just pay for the coverage. We don't want to have anything to do with how you cover it, of course. Of course. We, a group that believes that the climate is going nuts, that there is a climate catastrophe, that the earth is going to burn down, we will not have a common home, human beings will cease to exist, we're going to give you tens of millions of dollars, but we're fine if you say we're wrong. No one believes that. No one can believe that. But on this single lie, the Seattle Times has jettisoned any pretense of anything other than being a house organ for, leftist Democrats or, I don't know, Satan. I'm joking. I'll show you this in a second. The corruption is so intense that it can really have a deleterious effect, a really negative effect on your retirement. If you're 5 years from retirement, you probably didn't start building that money up 5 years ago. Unless you had to restart, you had a financial catastrophe, and in that case, God bless you. You've done it, 5 years, ready to retire. But in all likelihood, you spent a lifetime storing up that money, investing it and cutting costs. And if you're 10 years, 15 years, same thing. You didn't start last year with this. So that stuff, that money was stored. Your retirement system was created during a time where current events were very, very different. We weren't involved in multiple wars. We weren't funding both sides of a war between Hamas and Israel, which is biblical in scope. We weren't chemically and surgically mutilating kids. We weren't forcing people to purchase products they don't want from companies they don't like at prices they can't afford for services they don't need. That's now commonplace. None of these events were going on. So your retirement portfolio was also created for a time where there were rules about the economy, such as if a company's profits are growing by 8% a quarter, the cost of its stock is not going to grow by 80,000% per quarter, and yet that's happening. So your retirement account may well be a relic. It may well be a relic. Here's how to find out. My friend Zach Abraham is doing a free live webinar coming up the 26th of this month at 3:30 Pacific time. He's going to talk about current events and how they're affecting retirement accounts, how they might affect them in the future. He'll talk about Bulwark Capital Management's approach to this, which is centered upon risk management by actively managing every single portfolio, which can reduce risk and volatility. This event is free, but you have to register to attend. The easiest way to register is on the web. KnowYourRiskRadio.com, KNOW, KnowYourRiskRadio.com.
Investment advisory services offered through Trek Financial LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. The opinions expressed in this program are for general informational purposes only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual or on any specific security. Any references to performance of securities are thought to be materially accurate, and actual performance may differ. Investments involve risk and are not guaranteed. Past performance doesn't guarantee future results. Trek 24308.
This is an actual tweet put out by the actual Seattle Times with a picture of President Trump. Are you ready for this? Trump falsely claimed during the presidential debate Tuesday that protesters took over a big portion of Seattle during the Capitol Hill organized protests in 2020. He's falsely claimed. Well, let's see if we can find some ways to maybe, what would you call it? Fact check the Seattle Times? Let's start, first of all, with some nuance. Organized protest. It wasn't a protest. there were protests, and then there were riots and turning over police cars and burning them in the streets. Here's a different source. And it's a softball approach to this. Welcome to the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, where Seattle protesters gather without police. Hey, that's the Seattle Times. That's the same newspaper. Hey, look, they're calling it the Autonomous Zone. Who else did that? Antifa and Black Lives Matter Incorporated voted, or we're going to call it CHOP, which, by the way, had a double entendre intended. They said it at the time, chop their heads off, French Revolution, CHOP. They voted against that because CHAZ was cooler. So the Seattle Times played along. Yeah, CHAZ is cool. Let's call it that. So apparently there was this autonomous zone where so-called protesters gathered without police because the police said, we don't care. Nope. Because they were allowed to take over that part of the city. Because the failed mayor, Jenny Durkin, said, don't go in there. They got to take over a police station. They got to seize it, as well as some of the personal effects of the officers, like their wedding rings. They got access to personnel files because they were in there for about a week. Maybe the Seattle Times just has something that could disabuse us of all this. Here's another tweet, though, from the Seattle Times. This on 6/22/20. Breaking, shooting. The second in 48 hours was reported Sunday night in the area known as CHOP, or Capitol Hill occupied protest. One person with a gunshot wound was in serious condition at Harborview Medical Center. Wait, that sounds really chaotic. And there they are using the name agreed upon by Black Lives Matter Incorporated and Antifa again. That sounds really chaotic. In fact, if you watch the events live, there were many, many, many instances where there were shoot and move fights, gunfights in the Capitol Hill occupied protest. In other words, Antifa-stan. But then the Seattle Times reports this. New Capitol Hill residents and businesses sue Seattle for extensive harm they've faced as a result of the city's failing to disband CHOP. Wait a minute. Wait just a second. That sounds like there was an area in Seattle that became completely chaotic, that destroyed businesses and homes, and the police, the city, failed to disband it. This is beginning to sound a lot like protesters took over a big portion of Seattle during the Capitol Hill organized protests in 2020. It's beginning just from the pages of the Seattle Times. What was that thing about not lying? That's always a really hard commandment to remember. You shall not lie unless Orange Man. Is that in there? Is that the New American Standard Version? Or is that the Raphael, is that the Reverend Raphael Warnock version? No, that's the, I'm sorry. That's the Reverend Al Sharpton version. So his translation. And you know, probably the top expert in the world on Antifa. He responded to this tweet from the Seattle Times. This is disgusting gaslighting from Vaughn Afar and her editors at the Seattle Times. I was on the ground undercover. As their own reporting at the time stated, 6 streets in a densely occupied business and residential area were overtaken by armed force. The extremists belonged to BLM Antifa groups. People were killed in the chaos and anarchy lasted there for weeks. Black teens were called white supremacists and shot up. Yep. One of those teens was, I think, 15 years old, murdered. And the police and first responders couldn't get in to render aid because the so-called protesters wouldn't let them in. If you're looking at some of the visuals, you can hopefully see someone using a rangefinder in order to figure out where they're going to need to shoot. You can see people carrying guns, openly carrying AR-15s. You will remember the fun case of where a Seattle rapper pulled his Tesla up. Incidentally, his recording studio was underwritten by taxpayer dollars. He pulled his Tesla up and was handing out AR-15s on video. And no, in fact, the anti-gun Bob Ferguson, the so-called attorney general there, and Jay Inslee, the so-called governor, did not, in fact, have him prosecuted, even though it's illegal for you. If you're at a shooting range in Seattle and your uncle, a 40-year cop, wants to borrow your gun to shoot it and you hand it to him, you just committed a felony, and so did he. I think it's a felony or a misdemeanor. It's a crime. No, you have to do a background check on your cop, the uncle, your uncle, the cop. And I'm not talking about Uncle Dave, the drunk. Here's another. This is also from the Seattle Times. 2 teenagers shot in Seattle's CHAZ autonomous zone. What's this? This is a map. Wow, you know what? It's a map of Seattle. So it's a large map of the area around Seattle. It shows Seattle. And then within, it shows, first of all, it shows the globe, Washington State, then Seattle. Then look at this. It shows this entire region, including 2 parks. Well, it's actually 1 park, but 2 separate versions of the park, areas of the park. The abandoned police station, one of the most populated residential and business areas in all of Seattle, the Broadway area. And all of it taken over. Right there on the edge of the Antifa stand area was my therapist's office. She'd been practicing in Seattle for 33 years. And that was the thing that made her quit. And she was a staunch liberal in many ways. Seattle Staff Times reporter Lauren Gergels contributed to a report that reads, this is just part of it, the end of it, ultimately 4 shootings, including the killings of Anderson and 16-year-old Antonio Mays Jr. were reported in and around the CHOP zone. No one has been charged in Mays' death. The violence led Durkin to clear the zone using heavily equipped officers and tactical vehicles from Seattle police and other agencies with the threat to arrest anyone who stayed behind. Dozens of protesters were arrested. So if you're keeping track, Donald Trump falsely claimed during the debate that protesters took over a large portion of Seattle during the Capitol Hill organized protests. But none of that's true, says the Seattle Times, even though their own report said it took heavily equipped officers and tactical vehicles to shut down CHOP, that after 4 shootings. They forgot about the rape. They forgot about the murder, the young lady who was murdered by having nails hammered into her head as this guy named Travis live streamed it. They forgot that one. They forgot about the street preacher who was tackled and sexually assaulted on camera. They forgot about the attempt to burn down a car repair and body shop for high-end cars. They forgot that part. There aren't enough words to describe the Seattle Times and the lie that it is, but there is one word that matters, the Word of God, and they can't even succeed on, well, none of us do. We all should fall short, but not all of us broadcast lies of this nature at that volume.